sort of things really quickly, and then what we'll do is we'll dive into the material for Unit 3. So if you haven't already noticed, your lab exam scores have been posted. Okay. Overall, you guys did pretty well. A little bit lower than the first one, but it was also a lot of new material as well. So I'll hand those back today in lab, and we can talk about them a little bit more. But the lab exam scores are up on Canvas. As far as lecture exams go, I actually have them like 95% of the way done. I just need to connect your individual test score with your group test score and do the math there. So I should have those done maybe by the end of the day today. That's kind of my goal. I dropped a couple of questions from the individual portion. When I was taking a look at it kind of after the fact, I felt like maybe we didn't quite talk about those questions well enough. So I went ahead and dropped them. I'm contemplating adding them back in just to see what happens to the scores though. So I need to play around with the numbers a little bit more on your guys' lecture exams. What did you guys think of the exams though? What do we think of the lab exam on Friday? Were we Were we Were we What about the lecture exam? Okay, all right, yeah, it's surprising, and I don't mean this to be like me, because I definitely don't want to be, but the grades were a little bit lower than I expected on the lecture exam. And that surprised me because a lot of the same questions were on the lab exam that you guys answered correctly. So I'm trying to understand why there was a little bit of a disconnect between these questions asked on the lecture exam incorrectly, and then on the lab exam they were answered correctly. A really good example of that is thyroid hormone. Okay, what element do we need for thyroid hormone?
Iodine.
Iodine. Almost every single one of you wrote calcium on your lab exam. And I don't exactly understand why, because on the lecture exam, I asked the same question, and almost everybody put iodine as the correct answer. So I don't really understand that. Like I said, I need to spend a little bit more time kind of wrapping my head around the lecture exam, because I don't understand why you guys did pretty well on the lab exam, and the lecture exam had a lot of the same questions that were answered incorrectly. So I need to spend some time with that. But I'm happy, once I get those grades posted, again, hopefully today, maybe we can spend some time one-on-one with each other, sort of talking about that and trying to figure out a plan for the next test, because it's interesting to me. So we'll kind of go from there. All right. At any rate, I will get them done and everything else. I posted Unit 3 review questions. I've posted Unit 3 lecture notes. One of the things that I said in my announcement over the weekend is that I pushed the due date for those review questions until after the next exam. Your next exam happens to be on a Wednesday. It doesn't land on a Friday this time. And I figure if you guys are spending the weekend and the first part of the week preparing for the test, you probably don't want to be messing with those review questions. I mean, hopefully you're working on them as you go. But if you wanted to put the finishing touches on those, I made the due date after the exam. So you've got some extra time afterwards to do that. And a couple of people had approached me about not getting them finished before our last exam as well for Unit 2. If you turn them in late, obviously I'll still accept them. We don't want to turn them in too late, but if you're a couple of days late, it's not really the end of the world. As you can see, I haven't gotten to grading them yet, so you're not holding me up. So at any rate, that's kind of where we're at on that. But we'll get those lecture exams up on Canvas, and then we can talk about them and stuff like that. All right. Anything else I want to talk about? I don't think so. I think we can kind of leave it there, and then we can kind of dive into our new material for Unit 3. So Unit 3 is kind of the part of the class where we really shift gears. up until, like, gosh, the first, 6 weeks of the semester, we've been talking about cell-to-cell communication, either in the aspect of the nervous system or in the aspect of the endocrine system. And now we actually are starting to shift gears, and we're starting to move away from that. And we're starting to move into how individual organs and organ systems work. Personally, this is my favorite part of the class. Now that we've got all that other stuff behind us, we can get to the good stuff. But I do enjoy this unit a lot. I like talking about the cardiovascular system. And then Unit 4 will go into talk about the lungs and the kidneys. One of the things that you're going to see, hopefully, if I do my job right, is you'll see that the lungs and the kidneys, the respiratory system and the urinary system, are really closely connected to the cardiovascular system. Very, very similar to each other. So even though this class is not tested cumulatively, a lot of the concepts that we talk about here are going to be carrying over into the next couple of units in the class because there's a lot of overlap in the way that they function and the way that those organ systems interact with each other as well. We're also going to be getting into, in both lecture and lab, kind of a phase of the class where there's a lot more physiology. There's obviously a lot of anatomy, but we're going to be getting into a lot more physiology. One of the things that you could probably do to sort of help to prepare you for that is, if you're feeling shaky on action potentials from 50A, you might want to go kind of review action potentials from 50A to make sure that they're good. We're going to take an action potential on Friday and we're going to modify it, and we're going to look at how it looks in cardiac muscle cells. Not only that, we're going to do it twice because there's 2 separate action potentials in the heart. So we're going to take a look at both of those on Friday. So if you need to take a look at action potentials again, you certainly are welcome to do that. And I encourage it because it will really help you out a lot. If we go to Canvas really quickly, we go to Canvas really quickly. Notice that I have an optional nervous system background stuff, and I know a lot of you have already looked at this. It's a really long story. It's too long for right now. We used to sort of make this sort of extra credit because a lot of the students that we were having in 50B hadn't had the nervous system in 50A because of the way that the curriculum got changed. So this doesn't really matter so much. But these videos on neuron physiology go over the basis of an action potential. These are my lectures from COVID that I use. So they're recorded actually fairly well. So if you want to just rewatch those, it definitely won't hurt you as we start to move into some of the material on the heart. So I do have some lectures up here to sort of help you get jump started on neurophysiology, so that you guys have that. All right. Okay. With that said, let's go ahead and kind of dive back in here to our third unit on the cardiovascular system. So, you and I are big organisms. We contain about 75 trillion cells. And really, if you have anything more than about 1 or 2 cells, you're going to need a way to distribute nutrients and oxygen to your cells, and you're also going to need a way to get rid of waste. Okay? If you're a single-celled organism, right? My Bio 1 colleagues would probably get really upset with me for this one, but if you're a single-celled organism, let's go ahead and just kind of make something up. If that's you, you're all of one cell. getting nutrients to yourself is pretty easy, and getting rid of waste is also pretty easy. But what process do you think you're going to use to do those two things?
Endocytosis.
You could use endocytosis. You could maybe even make it a little simpler though. Endocytosis is a good answer. But what else could you maybe do? What would be even simpler than endocytosis? Diffusion, yeah, right? If you're a single cell organism, you can use very simple cellular processes like diffusion and osmosis if you need water balance changes. And then you can also can get rid of wastes in the same way, right? So exocytosis or diffusion, the waste that you produce kind of goes out the other direction. So if you're a single cell, diffusion works really, really, really well to distribute those things to, your entire body, as it were. But when you get to be a multicellular organism like you and I are, it becomes a lot harder to rely on diffusion. What's one thing that we know about diffusion? We know that it works really well. We know that we see it a lot. If you haven't figured it out yet, this class is all about diffusion. That's the whole basis of physiology is diffusion. But what else do we know about it? What's that? Depends on concentrations, right? And does diffusion generally happen pretty fast, or does it generally happen pretty slow? So slow, right? Diffusion is not quick. If we're relying solely on diffusion, it's a really slow process. You guys probably have had that. Have you ever had that? Has a teacher ever taught about diffusion where they have like some perfume and they spray it in this corner of the room, and then you smell it eventually over in the other corner of the room? Have you guys ever seen that demo? We know it works, right? I mean, if somebody comes in or somebody were to spray perfume over here, you'd eventually be able to smell it over in the other corner. If I were to accidentally toot up here, eventually you'd probably all smell it, which is why I don't do that. But at any rate, we often write that off as diffusion, but the reality is like if I were to spray some cologne or perfume over in this corner of the room, the reason that you'd be able to smell it all the way over there so quickly is not just diffusion. There's a lot of other stuff happening in here as well, right? The air is blowing things around. You guys are moving, and that's mixing the air. So it's moving that across a lot quicker. If we were relying solely on diffusion, it would take something like 3.5 months for those perfume molecules to diffuse from here all the way over to there. Diffusion is a very, very slow process. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to try to maximize that. And to do that in multicellular organisms, we can't rely just on diffusion or endo and exocytosis to move things around. We have to have something that's going to distribute those things a lot faster within our bodies. And that something that distributes these nutrients and oxygen and also wastes in our body a lot faster is our cardiovascular system. So as a result, what we have in our body, we have a series of blood vessels, a series of roads by which we're carrying a vehicle for those things, right? So that's really what our blood is it's a way to carry nutrients and oxygen and waste products around our body relatively fast, okay? So we have blood vessels, we have our blood, and we're going to talk about both of those things in this unit. And then, of course, we have to have a pump as well to move that stuff around really, really efficiently, okay? And that pump, of course, is our heart, okay? So we have kind of three aspects of our cardiovascular system that we're interested in. We have our heart, we have our blood vessels, and then we have our blood itself, okay? We're going to do our labs slightly out of order in this unit. We're actually going to start with the heart today, which I think is lab 13. I'm not positive off the top of my head, but it's not the next one in line. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do our blood vessels next week, and then we'll do our blood the week after that. So we're actually going to do our labs a little bit out of order, but I think it makes a little bit more sense to talk about them out of order that way. So with that said, let's go ahead and talk about that muscular pump, the heart. Okay? The heart is an organ, as you guys are all aware, that's found in your thoracic cavity. It's actually found between your two lungs. So we can see here that the lungs are actually being pulled away in this diagram. Lungs are actually being pulled away to expose the heart. What do we see about the heart? We see that there are several major blood vessels that are leading into and out of it. We'll talk about those blood vessels here in just a couple of minutes. We see that the heart is surrounded by membranes. Okay? So going way back, as one of my students said yesterday, that was the first week of 50A. Going way back in time to the first week of 50A, let's talk a little bit about some membranes. So we know that any body surface that's exposed to the exterior environment is lined by a mucous membrane, right? We learned that. What are the outsides of our organs lined by? What are those membranes called? Do you remember? So we have mucous membranes lining essentially the insides of many of those organs. And the outsides are lined by what? You're really close. Parietal, you're also really close. What are those two membranes together called? A visceral and a parietal layer are called what? No. Getting colder now. Ish. You're not wrong, but you're getting colder-ish. A serous membrane. Yeah, they're called serous membranes, right? Remember that serous membranes, we haven't really talked about internal organs yet, right? So we need to maybe talk about internal organs for a minute. They do. Pay no attention. Okay. So our internal organs are covered by serous membranes. Okay. Serous membranes Serous membranes have two layers to them. They have a parietal layer and they have a visceral layer. They have a parietal layer and a visceral layer. Okay. The visceral layer lies directly on the surface of the organ, and then the parietal layer is what's folded over and essentially creates that second layer. I have another slide to kind of show you this here in just a minute, but very often these serous membranes are named based for the organ that they surround, right? So here, you'll notice that the slide refers to the parietal pericardium. Okay? The pericardium is that serous membrane that surrounds the heart. Okay? It just has its name because it specifically surrounds the heart. They also cut in this diagram to make it easier. They cut the serous membrane that surrounds the lungs as well. That's called the pleural membrane. That's the serous membrane that surrounds the lungs. There would obviously also be a visceral component to both of those as well. We're not seeing those on this slide. But suffice it to say, these organs in the thorax or in the thoracic cavity lie in their own sort of sacs, right? The lungs are encased by that pleural membrane. The heart is encased by that pericardial membrane that we see here. And those are both examples of serous membranes that have both a parietal and a visceral layer to them. Okay? What this does is it creates little microenvironments around the organ. So for instance, I could have a different ion concentration in the extracellular fluid around the heart than I have around the lungs. Okay, and that's going to be important as we start to get to action potentials and things like that. So it lies in the thoracic cavity surrounded by this serous membrane. If we blow it up, if we blow the wall of the heart up, we can actually see that serous membrane. So this is the exterior wall of the heart right here. It's right up against one of those really big blood vessels. We're kind of blowing this region right here up. So we can see that visceral layer of the serous pericardium right here. Okay, and then as we see as it gets folded over, we have the parietal layer of that serous pericardium right there. So we're seeing the two layers of our serous membrane. And then there's an additional fibrous pericardium outside of that that has a lot more dense connective tissue that gives a little bit more structure to this. But those two layers are the parietal layer and the visceral layer. We do have a pericardial cavity then between the two layers. You'll notice that there is a space between these two layers that we call the pericardial cavity. All serous membranes have that space. Do you guys remember what we would find in that pericardial cavity? Find a fluid called serous fluid. Okay, so there's a fluid called serous fluid in there. So between that, we have that serous fluid. Okay. You know, in reality, we're not talking about a really big space right there at all. You know, this diagram makes you think that there's like a ½ inch between those two layers. There's not, right? They're basically right on top of each other. There's just a little tiny bit of fluid in between them. But what that does is it allows those two layers to slide past each other very, very easily. So when we move and things like that, you know, it creates sort of a friction-free environment for all of our organs to sort of slide around inside of us. Probably a picture you didn't want painted today is your organs sliding around inside of you, but there you go, they're slippery. So at any rate, that's, you know, it's more of a, I guess, a hypothetical space than an actual space, because generally those two layers lay basically on top of each other. There's just that little bit of fluid in between the two. That pericardial cavity can fill with fluid though, and that can put undue pressure on the heart. We see that a lot in things like congestive heart failure and things like that, when that cavity does fill up with excess fluid and it needs to be drained, right? That can be really, really problematic. So even though normally it has very little fluid in it, it can end up with fairly significant fluid in it. So we do see these three layers. We see the parietal layer, and then the fibrous pericardium, the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, and then that visceral layer right there. That visceral layer makes up one of the three layers of the heart wall because it does lay directly on the surface of the heart. The heart itself is a more or less hollow muscular organ. Muscle makes up the majority of the mass of the heart. What kind of muscle are we going to be talking about here? It's going to be cardiac, right? Okay, we're going to be talking about cardiac. We'll kind of spend a little bit of time introducing cardiac muscle this morning in lab, or I guess reintroducing cardiac muscle to you guys this morning in lab. But the majority of the heart is indeed muscle. That makes up the majority of it. And even in this cross-section of the heart, you see that muscle is the most prominent thing, right? We're looking at the wall of the heart right here. You see that almost all of it is muscle. And we call that layer the myocardial layer of the heart, right? Myo meaning muscle, cardium meaning heart, right? So that's the muscular layer of the heart. That visceral layer of the serous pericardium is, as I said, the outer layer of the heart. It's just that layer of epithelial cells that we see right there. We call that the epicardium. It's a little bit easier for a lab exam than saying the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, but I suppose you can say either one. And then the inner layer of the heart is another layer of epithelial cells that we call the endocardium, and we can see those right here. So a couple of layers of epithelial cells kind of sandwiching that layer of muscle into the layer of the heart. But when we look at a cross-section of the heart, it's generally pretty straightforward in terms of the way that it's structured and the way that it looks. All we have to do is learn the chambers, and the pathway of blood flow through the heart, and we'll be good to go. So it's not too bad. Any questions so far? Yeah. Yeah, those membranes are epithelial membranes, both the serous and the endocardium. I mentioned that pericardial cavity kind of filling with fluid with congestive heart failure and things like that. It can usually be drained off to relieve pressure on the heart, but that can impede heart function and can also press on the lungs as well that are surrounding the heart, and it can cause lung issues. Just kind of as an aside, the lungs also have this serous membrane surrounding them. That's those pleural membranes. When we have fluid building up in those pleural membranes, or in between those pleural membranes, we call that pleurisy, which can also be problematic for breathing and respiratory function as well. So the heart isn't the only organ that we can get fluid building up in between those parietal and those visceral layers. And you're definitely going to see those sorts of things as you kind of move on. You're going to see those types of things popping up, and they can definitely be very problematic for people. All right. Any other questions before we keep moving on here? All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the heart itself. So today in lab, the majority of lab is going to be spent, looking at the anatomy of the heart. What I want to do in lab today is I want to look a little bit at cardiac muscle, and then we'll look at the anatomy of the heart. We have a lot of heart models out in the lab for you guys to take a look at. But let's generally kind of take a look at the heart and look at some of its key features. We'll probably have to review a few of these once we get into lab. And on the models, there are some definitely trickier things that we're going to have to spend some time looking at in lab, but we can kind of give an overview of heart anatomy right now. So the heart, if we look at it sort of in a intact view like we have right here, we see a couple of things. We see that the heart itself has several major blood vessels here, both entering and leaving. Somebody outside banging on something? Okay. So we see that there are several major blood vessels, both entering and leaving the heart. Makes sense, right? It is the pump. There needs to be blood flowing both into it and out of it. We call those big vessels, kind of collectively, we refer to them as the great vessels. And we'll talk about those all here in just a couple of minutes. And then, of course, we have the heart itself. As far as the heart goes, the chambers called the ventricles really dominate when we look at the external view of the heart. We're going to look at a frontal section of it in a minute to actually get a view inside of those chambers. But the heart generally is kind of shaped like an inverted pyramid. So what we have is erase this really quickly. What we have is the area where these great vessels are entering and leaving the heart. And generally speaking, the heart is kind of broad and flat in that area. So we see the top of the heart has kind of this big, broad, flat area. And then the chambers of the heart kind of come down, and as we go down, it gets a little bit more pointed towards the bottom, right? So if I were to really sort of make the heart, conceptualize the heart right here, it kind of looks like this, sort of like an inverted pyramid, if you will. So if this is an inverted pyramid, and this is where you would find the broadest area right here, what do we call the bottom of a pyramid? The base. Yeah, we call it the base, right? So this is called the base of the heart up here, okay? And then the point where we see the sharpest area is called the apex of the pyramid, right? Or the peak, right? So the apex right here is the apex of the heart, which, like I said, probably is a little bit counterintuitive because it is like an upside down sort of a pyramid. On this diagram, we can see that the apex is labeled, but we see that we aren't really labeling the base of the heart on this diagram, obviously for clarity's sake. All right. Let's go ahead and open the heart up. Let's go ahead and take a look at those chambers. If we open the heart up, it shows us that there are indeed 4 chambers. Okay. We have 2 upper chambers. These are called the atria. So we have to remember that in all of these diagrams, this person is facing us, right? So this is their right side, this is their left side. So because of that, this would be the right atrium that we see right here, and then the left atrium would be over here. And then those 2 larger chambers that really dominate when we look at the heart from the outside are going to be the right ventricle and the left ventricle that we see right here, okay? So 4 total chambers. We have 2 atria and we have 2 ventricles. Why do we have 2 of each? Why don't we just have 1, all right? Why don't we just have an atrium and a ventricle? And why isn't that enough? Why do I need 2 of each? Okay. For whatever it's worth, fish hearts have 1 of each. They have a single atrium and a single ventricle. But you and I have 2. Okay, mammalian hearts have 2 of each. The reason we have 2 of each, the reason we have 2 atria and we have 2 ventricles, is because we have 1 heart, but we have what we call, or what we normally refer to as a double pump, okay? We essentially have to pump our blood to 2 separate places. Remember, the whole idea behind our blood is to do a couple of things. It's to distribute nutrients, but also to distribute oxygen to our tissues. So one of the things that we have to do with our blood is we have to make sure that we get oxygen into it, okay? What organ do we do that with? The lungs, that's right? We have to get it to the lungs. The lungs by themselves have a significant number of blood vessels. And we'll talk extensively about blood pressure and stuff like that as we kind of go through this unit. But when we push that fluid through a whole bunch of really tiny blood vessels, we lose a lot of pressure, okay? So we aren't gonna have enough pressure to then send the blood all the way out through the body as well. So what we have to do is we have to send that blood back to the heart and we have to repressurize it. So what we have is we have one side of the heart, the right side of the heart, is responsible for sending blood to the lungs, okay? The left side of the heart receives that blood from the lungs and it sends that blood out to the entire body, okay? So again, 1 heart, but we have essentially 2 pumps within that heart. We call it a double circulation, okay? We refer to it in a lot of different ways, okay? So we have what we call a pulmonary circuit and we have a systemic circuit. And I'll show you a slide in just a couple of minutes that kind of illustrates that for us. Okay, so the right side of the heart is going to then be receiving blood from the body, all right, and it's going to pump that blood to the lungs. Let's write that down really quickly, right? So the right side of the heart receives blood from body, pumps blood to the lungs. Okay. The left side of the heart going to receive blood in the lungs, and it's going to pump blood to the body. Okay? So two separate sides of the heart pumping blood essentially to two different places. All right? Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the right side of the heart, and let's talk about that blood that the right side of the heart is receiving. All right? So that blood has been out in the body. It's been delivering its oxygen to the body. It's also been delivering nutrients to the body. What can you guys tell me about the oxygen level in that blood that's coming back to the heart from the body? Would you think that it's relatively high in oxygen or relatively low in oxygen? Relatively low in oxygen. Yeah, indeed it is, right? It's relatively low in oxygen. We have a term for that. The term that we use to describe the oxygen level of that blood is, we use the term deoxygenated. We use that term deoxygenated to describe that. I don't really like that term because it implies that there's no oxygen in that blood. I'm going to prove to you guys in their next unit in the respiratory system that that's not the case at all. Not even close to being void of oxygen. But I guess because your book uses it, we can use that term, even though I don't like it. But deoxygenated implies low oxygen levels. I prefer poorly oxygenated, but that's me being picky, I guess. But anyway, that blood coming back to the right side of the heart from the body is what we call deoxygenated blood, or poorly oxygenated blood. Okay. Our models are going to use the color blue to distinguish blood vessels that have poorly oxygenated blood. So in this diagram, just like in the models that you're going to see in lab, you'll notice that these vessels that are leading in to the right atrium are colored blue. Okay? That color blue is going to denote poorly oxygenated blood in that vessel. All right? We do have two major vessels that lead into the right atrium. We have one vessel called the superior vena cava. It's right here. This vessel called the superior vena cava is carrying that deoxygenated blood from our head and our upper limbs back to the heart. Okay? And then we have our inferior vena cava right here that's carrying blood from our limbs as well as from our abdominal cavity back to the heart as well. Okay? So these vessels are draining our body of blood and they're sending that blood back to the heart. Okay? So the superior vena cava empties into the right atrium right here. The inferior vena cava empties into the right atrium right here. Okay? So those two major vessels are sending that blood back to the heart from the body. And as that color implies, that is deoxygenated blood. Okay. From the right atrium, that blood is going to flow into the right ventricle. Okay? And the ventricle is going to pump that blood out to the lungs. Okay? One of the things that you'll notice about our ventricles is you'll notice that the myocardial layer, that muscular layer, is a lot thicker here and here than it is in our atria, where the myocardium is a lot thinner. That myocardium needs to be thicker in our ventricles because the ventricles are always going to be pumping the blood out of the heart. Okay? So we see here that we're going to pump the blood out of the heart. The blood vessel that carries that blood to the heart is called the pulmonary trunk. We can see that right here. And that splits into two pulmonary arteries. We have a left pulmonary artery right here, and we have a right pulmonary artery right here. That blood Once it's in the lungs, it's going to drop off its waste product, which is carbon dioxide. It's going to pick up oxygen, and it's going to send that oxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart. So oxygenated blood vessels. Oxygenated blood vessels are going to be denoted by the color red. Okay? This is true on our models, it's true in our diagrams, it's true on just about everything that we're going to be looking at. So you'll notice, and this one does not actually show the colors very well, I guess it shows it okay, but you'll notice that you have pulmonary veins right here and right here. These are your right pulmonary veins, and you have left pulmonary veins carrying that oxygenated blood back to your heart, and that blood is being received by the left atrium that we see right here. Okay. That blood goes then into the left ventricle, and then it gets pumped out the aorta into the systemic circulation, and it pumps that blood to the body. It delivers our blood to our body. Okay. So we have oxygenated blood coming into and out of the right side of the heart, and we have oxygenated blood going into and out of the left side of the heart. So we can kind of show that in a number of different ways. This diagram I always think is particularly helpful. It shows that pulmonary circuit that's pumping blood to the heart, and it shows that systemic circuit that pumps blood to the body. And it does show that we have two circulations. We have the right side of our heart pumping that blood to the lungs, the left side of our heart pumping that blood to the body. These are matched to each other. They work at the exact same rate. We'll talk more about that in this unit as well. But again, you can see those colors, blue and red, denoting oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood. So we'll practice this again today in lab. But one of the things that we're going to need to do is like this pathway of blood flow through the heart with these major blood vessels, the vena cava, the pulmonary arteries and veins, and the aorta. We're going to have to that's going to have to be memory. Like we're just going to do that until it's ground into our memories, because we're gonna obviously be branching off, and we're going to be naming some of the other vessels that kind of come from this. But if you have this memorized and this becomes something you can do in your sleep, it's going to make life a little bit easier over the next couple of weeks. So we're going to practice it again today in lab with some heart models and things like that. But we're going to kind of expand on some of that in the next couple of weeks. So we want to make sure that we practice the basics today. So the myocardium is thicker in the ventricles. But again, those ventricles are the ones doing the pumping out of the body. If we compare the right ventricle and the left ventricle, you'll see that the left has a much thicker myocardium. Why do you think the left would have a thicker myocardium than the right side? The right side pumps to the lungs, the left side pumps to the body. Why do you think one would be thicker than the other? The left side pumps to the rest of the body, and it has to be stronger. That's about it, right? There's a lot more blood vessels in the body than there are in the lungs. Okay. So we'll talk about blood vessels probably next week. But just to give you an idea, right? We're talking about big things here. So most of your blood vessels are exceptionally small, right? We're going to spend some time talking about capillaries, which are very, very small blood vessels. The big blood vessels, the ones that we are going to be naming and stuff like that in lab next week, account for a very small percentage of all of your blood vessels. But if you were to take out all of those big blood vessels and lay them all end to end, and then take all of those really small, almost microscopic capillaries that we also have in our body and lay those and just make one big long line of blood vessels, okay? Take them out of every organ in your body, your lungs, your brain, your digestive organs, all of that. you'd have about 50,000 miles of blood vessels is what you'd end up with. I want you to think about that for a minute. You have about 50,000 miles of blood vessels in your body. It's not continuous, it's not wholly linear, right? A lot of them are arranged parallel to each other to maybe make it a lot shorter. But you have about 50,000 miles of blood vessels in your body. That's an astounding number, right? And our heart is pumping that blood through those 50,000 miles of blood vessels. So we're going to have to talk about the pressure that our heart creates to be able to do that. So we're going to talk about blood pressure. How many of you guys know how to measure blood pressure? Yeah? A few of you guys? All right, cool. Well, by the end of this unit, you guys are all going to know how to do it because we're going to practice in the lab. So we're going to all get some practice measuring blood pressure. And it's kind of cool to be able to do that and then know what it is that you're actually measuring. But you're measuring essentially the amount of pressure that the heart creates in order to pump that blood through the entire body. All right. So 4 chambers. We have the atria and then we have the ventricles. One of the things that you'll also notice here is that there are valves that are between the chambers, okay? You'll notice on both sides of the heart, between the atria and the ventricles, there's a valve called the atrioventricular valves. They're named logically, right? They're valves between the atrium and the ventricle, so they are the atrioventricular valves. The one on the right side is the right atrioventricular valve. The one on the left side is the left atrioventricular valve. And then we also have valves that we see at the entrance of the pulmonary trunk right here. And then it's a little hard to see on our diagram, but right here at the entrance of the aorta is another valve. Those are called the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. They're also called semilunar valves, although that terminology isn't used quite as often as it used to be. What do valves do? Like in general, what does a valve do? Yeah. It can control the direction of flow, right? That's one of the important things that a valve does. Now, anywhere, right? Even in the plumbing in your house, you have valves that control the direction of flow of water, for instance, right? Yeah, valves do that, right? They control flow. Specifically, they control the direction of flow here, all right? These valves that we see between the atria and the ventricles, as well as at the entrance of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, control the direction of blood flow. We want blood in the heart to flow in one direction, right? So, we can think about our heart and the blood inside of it as like a big water balloon, right? Imagine that you've got a water balloon that won't break if you squeeze it, right? But if you squeeze it and it doesn't break, what's going to happen when you squeeze that water balloon? Some of the balloon's going to push this way and some of the balloon's going to push this way, right? When our ventricles contract, what's going to happen is that some of that blood is naturally going to go this way, the way it's supposed to go, but some of that blood naturally wants to go this way as well, right? We don't want the blood to go backwards in the heart. We only want it to go in one direction. So we have a valve there to protect that from happening, okay? We'll talk a little bit more today in lab about the components of these valves and the way that they look. It's a little bit easier when I have a model in front of me rather than just a diagram. But suffice it to say, we want to make sure that the heart is the most efficient pump possible. And one of the ways that it becomes efficient is to ensure one-way blood flow in the heart. And our valves serve that function. They ensure, I guess, one-way blood flow in the heart, right? So we have atrioventricular valves, and then we have these semilunar valves, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, that are going to ensure that one-way flow within the heart. Okay. So it's an interesting system that we have to help that to occur. And again, in lab today, I'll be able to show you guys on some of our models a little bit more about the anatomy of the valves and talk about the way that they function a little bit more. All right. Let's see. Anything else? Another thing that we notice when we look at the surface of the heart is we notice that the heart itself has a number of blood vessels on it, on the surface of the heart. There are two primary vessels that supply the heart with blood. We have a left coronary artery right here, and we have a right coronary artery right here. Those are named coronary arteries because they sit on top of the ventricles like a little crown, thus the corona that they're named for. They do provide the heart with oxygen and nutrients. I think sometimes we forget that because the heart is continuously filled with blood, it actually needs its own blood supply as well, because it is a working muscle as well. So we have to supply the heart with nutrients and oxygen in order to do its job. And that's the job of those coronary arteries and then the branches that of course come off of them. Usually we see quite a bit of fat on the surface of the heart as well. This diagram shows some adipose tissue on the surface of the heart. The heart is, as I said, a working muscle, and it needs a fairly constant supply of fuel. Having fat close by will allow it to do that. Incidentally, your heart does run primarily on fat. It uses very little sugar. It uses quite a bit of fat. If we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about heart metabolism. It's kind of interesting. But we do see a number of blood vessels on the surface of the heart as well that you guys will have the opportunity to view and identify on some of our models. All right. I think we're a couple of minutes early, but I think that puts us at a good stop.